What's up? I'm Hello Ego with EDMProd, and today I'm going to show you how to recreate any sound in 7 steps. These 7 steps are not specific to any genre or particular sound, and they can be applied to any sound you'd like to recreate. Today, we're going to be recreating the donk bass from Skrillex's Inhale Exhale. It's a really cool sounding bass, and though it might sound kind of complicated to create, it's actually not as difficult as you might think. If you like this tutorial and want to learn more, I definitely recommend you check out the EDMProd Mastermind community. This is a free student community where you can get feedback on your tracks, free Ableton project files, and access to a bunch of secret members-only YouTube tutorials. Link to that's in the bio if you're interested in checking it out. All right, let's dive in. Step 1 is project organization. If you don't get your project set up right first, it's going to be much more difficult as you're trying to analyze and recreate the sound. The first thing you want to do is download the sound or song you're trying to recreate and throw it into an audio track in your DAW. Make sure the track is unwarped. Next, we want to figure out the tempo of this track. The easiest way to do this is to find a portion of the track that has a really obvious beat or rhythm to it. Luckily in this one, the beginning of the track is pretty obvious. It's got that really nice beat. I can see all the different drum hits here. And if I count this out, I can kind of count the snares being on 2 and 4. That means I want to make sure that these snares right here and here land on the 2 and the 4 of each measure. Next thing you want to do is move around Ableton's master tempo. That's going to slowly shift your audio around until you see it line up with the grid. So this is looking pretty close, but just to be sure, I always check further along in the track. If it's a slightly wrong tempo, then the audio will desync from the Ableton grid. That seems to be what's happening here. It looks like these should be on the grid, but they're not. That means the project tempo is close, but not exact. From here, I'll go back and move it around until it all snaps to the grid. Looks like this project's at 145 BPM. Next thing you want to do is load up whatever synth you're going to use to try and recreate this sound. For this, we're going to be using Serum. And it's probably a really good idea to set up an A/B monitoring situation so you can switch between the reference and your sound design. This is pretty easy to do. All you have to do is turn off one of these 2 tracks, enter key mapping mode by clicking the key button up here in the top right of the screen, and then clicking on the on-off button for each track and pressing whatever key you'd like to map to both of them. I'm going to use the tilde key since it's not really used for anything else. And now whenever I press my tilde key, it turns one off while turning the other on. The last thing we have to do in step 1 is figure out the notes for the sound that we're trying to recreate. Let's make a MIDI clip and make sure to turn on this little headphone icon here so that way when you insert a MIDI note, you can hear it. This first note's an F. I'm going to skip these next 2 right now and go for the last 2 because they're both the same note. Sometimes it's really helpful to sing the note as well. That can help you center the pitch. Dun dun. Dun dun. There it is. Obviously in the wrong octave, we'll fix that after. All right, let's try and get these next 2. We're going to start with this one. Dun, dun. So I know this pitch is lower than the C sharp that I've got here. Dun, dun. There it is. So this note's a C. Last one we have to get is this one. Dun, dun. Let's go ahead and try and find that pitch. Dun. There it is. So all we do is jump octaves in the F right here. Let's get these into the right octave. There we go. We've got the notes. We are ready to go on to step 2. Step 2 is all about analysis. And for this, I'm going to be using my eyes just as much as I'm using my ears. By inspecting the waveform, that can tell us a whole lot about this sound. Before we do that, let's discuss the 3 main components that make up any sound. You've got the timbre, which is basically the harmonic content of the sound, how bright, how dark it is. You've got the amplitude, that's whether or not it starts quiet, gets louder, stays loud the whole time, or decays at the end, or has any kind of amplitude modulation, just how loud the sound is over time. And then you have the pitch, and the pitch is how high or low the sound is. And here you want to think about whether or not there's any pitch modulation as well. When you're looking at the waveform, it's pretty easy to get a lot of information about what's going on with the timbre. Let's just take a look at this first note here. Higher frequencies will show up as faster, darker waveforms, and lower frequencies will show up as slower waveforms like this. So what this is telling me is that this sound is going from brighter to darker. You can really hear the sound go dow, Dow. This brings up another really good technique. What's the original synthesizer? It's the voice. So we can actually use our voice to determine a few things about sounds. So let's think about the amplitude. How do you change the amplitude of your voice? You use more or less air. So if I want to make a very quiet sound, I'll use less air. And if I want to make a very loud sound, I use more air. Now let's think about pitch. Singing up higher, you want to tighten your vocal cords. Oh. And going lower, you loosen them up to get the lower pitches. Oh. The last one is filtering, the timbre. And it's your lips and your tongue and your mouth that handle all of that. So if you want to make a very bright sound, that's a much more open position with the mouth. And a darker, more filtered sound, whereas everything's much more closed down. Ooh, wah. So if we combine all three of these together, that gives you a little information about the timbre, pitch, and amplitude of any sound. So if I go dow, dow, what I'm doing here is I'm keeping the pitch the same, I'm closing my lips and my mouth to filter some of the high frequencies down, and I'm using less air over time. And that's what we can see happening here. The amplitude is decaying towards the end, the waveforms are getting smaller. And that's telling me that it's going to be a quieter sound. And there's less high frequencies like we mentioned earlier. So this is a really great start, and let's just move on to step 3. This is where we're going to start to work with the timbre of this sound. The first thing I want to do here is create a more harmonically rich tone. I'm going to start with frequency modulation, or FM synthesis. To me, this just really sounds like FM. In short, FM synthesis is where you take the output of one oscillator and use it to modulate the frequency of a second oscillator. If you're interested in learning more about FM synthesis, there's a link in the description to a video we put out a while ago that takes you all the way through it from start to finish. I'm going to set the two oscillators in here to basic shape sine waves. And then for oscillator B, I'm going to turn the level down. I don't actually want to hear this oscillator. I'm just going to use the output of it to frequency modulate oscillator A. I also probably want a separate sub. So I'm going to turn sub on and set this to direct out. What we have right now is just simple sine waves. It might be difficult to hear, but occasionally the volume is dipping down. That's because we have the phase randomization turned on. We want to turn the phase random down for both of these oscillators. When you have phase randomization turned up, that means that the waveform will start anywhere within its cycle. So it could start here, it could start here, it could start here. But if you turn phase randomization down, then that means the waveform will always start from this point right here. And it helps you get a more consistent sound, especially when you're dealing with low frequencies and basses. Let's also make sure our voicing is set to mono, so we only have one note playing at a time. The next thing I want to do is set this to FM from B, and we're just going to play around with this until we get a tone that's pretty close to the original. There we go. Now we've introduced more upper harmonics into the sound. But as we mentioned before, this looks like the upper harmonics decay over time. So we have to set up an envelope to add some FM and then turn it down over the course of the note. So let's go ahead over to envelope 2 and drag and drop it over here and add just a little bit of envelope 2 to the FM from B. Now we need to make envelope 3 into more of a plucky shape. To do this, I'll drag the sustain down. And I'm just going to adjust the decay time here until I feel like it's somewhere where it sort of decays at the same rate as the original. Let's go back and check the original. So I think we need a little more decay on this. This is a pretty good start, but I'm also hearing more of an attack on the original. It's got like a very sharp attack, which means I might want to set up a second envelope or an LFO to increase the FM even more, but very quickly in order to create that attack sound. Let's use LFO 1 for this, and I'm just going to set it to a decay and then envelope mode. I'm going to turn this off of BPM, set it to some faster rate like 44.4. Let's assign this over to the FM from B. And just give it more of a pluck. One thing I'm noticing is I'm not really getting the high frequencies that I'm hearing in the original. So I'm going to try and actually change the octave of the FMing oscillator to see if I can bring some higher frequencies in. I think that's the move right there. Octave 1 on oscillator B. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now, because we have these two oscillators holding down the lower mids and the mid frequencies and the sub holding down the low fundamental, we should probably get rid of the lows out of these two oscillators. To do this, we can go over to the effects, Let's just try a high pass 24, set this to about 100 hertz. There we go. So now we've got our lows and our highs separate from each other. I always like to go and check back in with the original from time to time. Hey, we're getting pretty close. We're getting there. I do think we need to add a little bit of filtering to sort of filter out some of the highs being created by the FM. I'll keep this on the low 12 setting here. Turn the cutoff all the way down. And let's make a new envelope that controls the filter cutoff. I'll pull the sustain down a little bit. And let's give it a little drive and some fat as well. This gets us through the general timbre of the sound. So for step 4, we're going to move on to the amplitude envelope. What I'm aiming for here is a shape that's kind of like this, where we've got like a nice fat waveform that decays just at the end. We're going to go over to envelope 1 for this and pull the sustain all the way down. This is a bit too plucky of a sound. It's decaying, but we're losing the body. For amplitudes, I like to make a new audio track and set it to resample our sound design track. And we can compare these two and adjust our envelope accordingly. You see how we're getting like a triangular shape when we really need like a big fat torpedo shape. I'm actually going to increase the bend on the decay here and set the decay time so the amplitude stays high and then falls off just at the end. See, that's too quick. That's getting a lot closer. There we go. Let's stick with 412 and maybe even increase the curvature of this decay a little more. I'll zoom in so we can kind of see what's going on better. Pretty good, pretty close. But something else I noticed about the amplitude is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of sub in the beginning. We're getting a lot more of just the higher frequency waveforms. So I'm going to go and add LFO2 as a second envelope. Set this to envelope mode. I'll keep this on synced. And what I'm going to do is attach this to our sub frequency levels. Let's pull this down to, I don't know, maybe around here and start off with that. Yeah, do you see how that sort of decreases the sub in the beginning? Gives it a little more of an attack time when compared to the higher frequencies of the FM tone. We're getting pretty close here. So after we've got our amplitude locked in, it's time for step 5. Now, in this situation, I don't believe that the pitch is modulating on these notes very much. If we want to double check that, what we can do is we can open up a spectrum and just look at the harmonics and the fundamental frequencies of each note. If we see them moving around in the spectrum, that means the pitch is changing. But if they hold steady, then the pitch is pretty solid and is not being modulated or changed over time. Do you see how the fundamental and the harmonics just hold steady? They don't move around, they don't shift. This is telling me that there's no pitch modulation or pitch envelope. So I don't really need to do anything with step 5 for this particular example. But for the sake of demonstration, I added a little bit of a pitch change here to the original. On the spectrum, that would look like this. Do you see how this pitch now starts lower and kind of rises up? We can hear it as well. Do. If I wanted to emulate this in Serum, I could double click the clip, go to my envelopes, set the mixer drop down to MIDI control, and the second one to pitch bend. And then I can go ahead and add a little pitch bend like that. The pitch bend is set to -2 and +2, so this is going to be starting 2 semitones lower. And now it sounds something like this. But because there's no pitch modulation, we don't need to do any of that. We can move right on to step number 6, checking the stereo content. Does the original sound have some width to it? There's a couple of ways you can check this, but my favorite way is to use Voxengo Span. Span is a free spectrum analyzer from Voxengo. There's a link to it in the description if you want to grab it yourself. And when you get Span, it'll look something like this. The green here shows the distribution of frequencies across the spectrum. But if you go up next to the routing button, click the drop down and set it to mid-side stereo, and then you go to where it says underlay and choose side, all of a sudden we have a second spectrum superimposed on the green one. And that second kind of reddish colored one is showing the stereo content. So I'll drag the span down to my master and we're going to compare the stereo content between theirs and mine. Mine is perfectly mono, so what we have to do is add a little stereo content in. So let's move over to the effects section to do this. There's a few ways you can do this in Serum. You can either add a hyper dimension, you can add some chorus. Any of these are going to add some width. I might play around with both of them a little bit. So I'll first turn on hyper dimension. I'm going to turn the hyper mix down and just play around with the mix of dimension. I don't know if you can hear that. If you're listening on a phone, it might be a little difficult, but if you're listening on headphones, you can hear that it's much wider. I don't know if I want it that wide, so I'm going to turn the width down just a bit. There we get a little bit of width, and if we take a look at span, we've added some width in. I don't know if we need that much. I'll go back to the original and compare it. It's actually pretty spot on, so let's just leave it right there. I also might try adding a chorus in here as well. Turn the mix down a little bit. I don't think it's adding too much width. It's kind of more of a tone shaper in this situation, so whatever it is, I like it and I want to stick with it. A lot of this process is really just turning things on and trying it out. Whenever I'm trying to recreate a sound, it's try something, tweak it, and whatever works, that's what you roll with. You can always go back and change things like the timbre or the amplitude if you need to. It's a pretty dynamic sound, so I'm going to add a compressor in here as well. Turn up the threshold. And then we're getting some gain reduction, so I'm going to add that back in with the makeup gain. The next thing I want to do is darken the sound by adding an EQ with a high cut and a low cut. But the resonance is turned up really high. It's adding way too much resonance. So I'm going to go ahead, pull those down a bit. I'll keep this frequency knob somewhere around here. And I'll turn this one up a little bit. There we go. That's a little better. You know, maybe I don't need the gain here because I actually think I want to turn this whole thing up. Let's go back over here to the basic shapes and turn this oscillator up. Oh yeah, that's what was missing right there. Maybe a little more on the master output as well. Let's go back and do another visual comparison to see where we're at. Pretty close. I think we might need a little more drive, maybe a little more fat. And then on the channel itself, I might just put a limiter to kind of keep this first chunk of it really in check. That's pretty close. And that brings us to the final step, step number 7. Are there any effects? Do you hear any reverb, any delay? We already added a little bit of chorus in here, but that was really more in service of getting the sound to be a bit wider and more spread to match the original reference track. I don't think I hear any reverbs or any delays on this. It sounds pretty dry for the most part, so I don't think we actually have to worry about any effects on this one. So there you go. It's the 7 steps I take every time I'm trying to recreate a sound. It always takes a little bit of playing around and going back and forth and turning things on and off and tweaking. But if you keep yourself organized and approach this with an understanding of what you need to do and when, then it's much easier to figure out why a sound sounds the way it does and what you can do to recreate it.